Ya lo dejamos. En el Queen Mary es conocido por su trabajo sobre la evolución de los sistemas sensoriales y la cognición, utilizando las interacciones entre insectos y flores como modelo de estudio. Chitka ha hecho contribuciones fundamentales en la comprensión de la cognición animal y su impacto en la adecuación evolutiva, estudiando en abejorros y en abejas. Entonces, les dejamos con la presentación del doctor. Si quieren hacer preguntas, siéntanse libres de hacer las preguntas en español, también en inglés. Entonces, pues los dejamos.
Muchísimas gracias. Sí, la charla es en inglés, pero si yo hablo demasiado rápido, me dicen, y todo es interactivo. Entonces, si es mejor hablar en español, yo puedo prueba. Mi español es muy mal, pero yo entiendo mucho. Pásale, hay muchos sillas aquí enfrente. Bueno. So yeah, I've spent much of my career researching the sensory system, the color vision, and the learning behavior of bees, but surely it's still a big step from that to talking about the mind of an insect. So I guess I owe you a bit of an explanation what I actually mean by that. So what I want to explore today, is the question of whether an insect such as a bee could actually be thought of as a thinking and a feeling being. And these are difficult questions. Obviously, you can see that in contemporary debates about the question of whether AI systems think or feel. There is no universally accepted proof for this question, but we can argue based on probabilities. And that's what I want to try today. So my talk will be deliberately speculative, but hopefully that will kickstart an interesting discussion. So I want to ask if bees have representations, mental representations of things, of space, and things in space. I want to ask whether, as opposed to a hypothetical being that lives permanently in the present and only responds to current incoming stimuli, whether bees have an appreciation of at least the immediate future by way of understanding the outcomes of their own actions, and also flexible access to past memories. And finally, and perhaps most controversially, I want to explore if bees might be said to have emotion-like states. So I think there is a common understanding that social insects can do impressive things. If you look at the architectures, in this case, this is a building of a termite hill on the left side, and on the right side, the famous La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And if you divide the scale factor out, then at least superficially, these two constructions look somewhat similar. But common thinking is that they come about by entirely different pathways. That in the human case, there's an architect who plans and dreams up the whole thing, and then passes instructions to engineers and builders and so on, who then put the vision of the architect into reality. But everything is thought to progress by top-down planning. And on the other hand, the way most people think about insect architectures is that there's no planning, no intelligence, that all the builders are basically hardwired to have innate behavioral routines that generate these kinds of architectures. So there is a perception, a common perception, that in the human case, everything is intelligent top-down planning, and everything in the insect case is essentially mindless mechanicity. And let's see if we can deconstruct this dichotomy a little bit. Now, the fascination with insect architectures is not new. Obviously, people for millennia have thought about how this wonderful regularity in the honeycomb comes about. You can see it here on the bottom left. If you take a broader perspective across the animal kingdom, no vertebrate, the human species aside, builds anything as regular and mathematically optimal as the honeycomb. Okay, beavers build dams and birds build nests, but these are considerably messy, amateurish affairs compared to this highly regular structure that is also, it's optimal in terms of minimizing material usage while maximizing stability and storage space. It's also double-sided, so the two sides interface and so on. And of course, that has been fascinating for scholars for a long time. And the first person to reason how these architectures might come about, to my knowledge, is Comte de Buffon, a French naturalist, who said the following. He said, place together in the same room 10,000 automatons, animated with a living force, and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. And this several century-old quote is actually a curious mix of a bottom-up perspective. So he says you just put all these individuals together in a common space and somehow these architectures will magically arise. But he also refers to the bees as conscious beings and seems to take it for granted that they have feelings and so on. And of course, we know that it's not quite so simple. So you can't put, let's say, 10,000 rhesus monkeys together in a common space, or fruit flies or zebrafish, and they'll suddenly start building something. So it takes a little more than just putting thousands of conscious beings together in a shared environment. But the first person to experimentally explore how bees build honeycomb was François Huber, a Swiss naturalist, who with his team was the first to actually explore the inner workings of a beehive by experimenting with hives with glass walls. And the normal construction process, as you can see here in honeycomb, always starts at the top, and then bees use gravity as a reference to gradually build downwards until they've reached with their construction somewhere near the bottom of the cavity in which they nest. And the first thing that Huber and his team noticed over 2 centuries ago, when they inserted a glass ceiling into the hive box, was that bees didn't like very much to use a slippery glass surface for the foundations of their comb. Perfect. And so what the bees did in that case is they inverted the entire construction routine, built the foundations at the bottom, and built the comb upwards like a tower construction. And you might say, well, that's still a repetitive activity. It still looks robotic because it's the same sort of structure. But if you had built a simple robot to mimic the natural process, start at the top, use gravity as a reference, build downwards, that robot would already fall on its face with this simple challenge, unless you added to your program a routine that said, if you can't start at the top, start at the bottom and invert the reference to gravity, or you'd have to give it the desired end product of the architecture. But the team then decided to challenge the bees a bit further. So they were very visionary, I think, in probing bees' flexibility. Remember, these are over 200 years old experiments. So they then said, right, let's make this a bit harder. Let's insert both a glass ceiling and a glass floor. What did the bees do? They started on one of the side walls of the cavity of the hive box and built the construction laterally through the cavity until that reached the opposite wall. So another degree of freedom. But the most remarkable thing happened when, after the bees had begun their normally two-dimensional construction, the authors inserted an obstacle, a glass wall, on the far side target wall. So the bees directed their construction in the direction of that wall, as you can see in panel B. And you might expect they might continue pottering away day after day until their construction had reached that far wall. And you might then think, okay, after they've got there and realize, okay, this is perhaps a somewhat unstable target, let's build some reinforcements, perhaps some vertical wax columns. But that's not what happened. Instead, what the bees did days before that future suboptimal outcome might have been reached is that they turned their entire construction 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. And so the remarkable thing here is that the corrective action was not taken after a suboptimal or potentially unstable construction had been built, but days before that future scenario was reached. And Hubert at the time exclaimed that I acknowledged that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. So he thought that there must be some advanced planning to avoid a future suboptimal outcome. Unfortunately, to this day, no one has replicated these experiments with modern sample sizes and exploring which bees in the construction process do the evaluation of the target wall and so on. But to my mind, these are very visionary experiments in basically exploring how far can you probe animals' flexibility in departing from the kinds of challenges they naturally encounter. No bee colony in their entire evolutionary history has ever been faced with glass surfaces inside their environments. Now, the way in which we nowadays study bees' learning behavior mostly is in the context of flower visitation. And the first thing you realize in that context is, of course, that bees' perceptual world is very different to our own. So bees can see ultraviolet light as opposed to us. And that means that, of course, in many flowers, they can see patterns of multiple colors where we see only a single color. And that, first of all, is a healthy reminder that the world we see is not the physical or the comprehensive physical world, but that the world we see and other animals see is filtered through the specific sense organs that we have acquired through evolution, and other animals have very different sensors. The other challenge in being a flower visitor is, of course, that you have to be essentially a careful shopper in the flower supermarket. That is, you have to, the commodity that you're interested in is nectar or pollen, which you can't easily assess remotely in a flower because it's to some extent hidden. But you can remember the colors, the patterns, the scents that are associated with the rewards of a flower. Pásale, pásale, hay muchas sillas aquí enfrente. And so very much like human shoppers in a supermarket, where you learn to associate certain products with their quality and their price, of course, the efforts that you have to invest in getting the rewards. The bees have to learn these signals, the advertisement that the flower species has, to associate with the rewards that you can find. Very much like you might do when you acquire a preference for a certain brand of toothpaste. You've realized the quality is good, the price is acceptable, so you remember the advertising, the packaging, to return to the same product, unless, of course, the quality goes down or the price goes up, in which case you resample other products and you might then change your preference. And that's also what bees have to do. And in a sense, we capitalize on the bee's flexibility in associating almost anything with reward. And so what you see on the top left here is a honeybee about to land on a platform with a drop of sugar water. That's always the reward that we give the bees, in front of an image of a human face. And once the bee has done that a few times, we then confronted with essentially like a crime witness test, where we're now presenting more than one face and ask which one face was the one that was previously linked to a reward. But of course, in the test, there are no rewards present, and the spatial position has been shuffled. And it turns out that bees are very good. They perform at about 80% distinguishing all of these pairs of faces in some cases, even though they're at least relatively similar. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the bees recognize the faces as faces. It just means that they're fairly flexible in associating any visual pattern with a sugar reward. And the other thing which is cognitively challenging in a bee's world is navigation. You might also have at some point or another experienced the challenges when you've visited a foreign town. This is Shanghai, where you couldn't read the signs, you couldn't easily ask for directions, and perhaps your phone was out of charge. So you had to navigate using just memory of landmarks. But in urban environments, of course, that task is facilitated by the fact that all of these buildings are built to be memorable. The architects want them to be unique and to stand out, not to aid your navigation, but you can use them for that purpose. But of course, most natural landscapes look a bit more like this. So this is a landscape near Popocatépetl, and I can tell you from personal experience, it is tough to navigate that sort of landscape without technology, without a map, just by yourself, just memorizing where you've been, because there are probably many thousand trees in this image that all look similar. There are several hill shapes that all look similar. And if there are no paths, then getting lost is very easy. And so that's a bee's challenge, or any animal's challenge that has a home base in a wild environment. And so there might be a bee nest in this tree or under this tree that you can just so make out. And you have to find that very tree again if you want to find your way back home and survive, because if you miss it, you die. And of course, in addition to that, you have to memorize the path to perhaps a nectar patch that's behind this hill here. Over there, 2 kilometers away, there might be a good pollen patch over here. And yes, these landscapes are often foggy, so you can't always see more distant landmarks or the sun. Nonetheless, your daily challenge is to find the way back to this particular tree on a reliable basis. And the way we now study bees navigation is with this technology called harmonic radar, where the bottom dish emits a signal that's picked up by a so-called transponder on a bee's back, bounces it back, and this signal is then the harmonic of the original signal is then picked up by the top dish. And in that way, we can reconstruct the bee's position while she navigates in space. So someone asked yesterday about the contrast between an individual-based focus and the kind of collective swarm-based intelligence that often people think in those terms in social insects. We have a very individual-based focus. In this case, the whole team of us scientists is dancing around one bee, in some cases for weeks. So it's us we outnumber our experimental bees sometimes. And doing this, of course, we can reconstruct not just the 3D position of the bee in which it flies, but also, because we know the direction of locomotion, we can reconstruct the view from the cockpit of the bee, essentially. We can see what the bee sees, and that's what we've done in this simulation. The two boomerang shapes that you see here are basically the view through a bee's eyes. And you can see that the view is quite pixelated, coarse-grained, because the spatial resolution of bees is much worse than in humans. On the other hand, they can compensate by being able to process more information per unit time than humans can. And of course, the dream ultimately with this technology is that we can find out what the bee actually, which landscape features it picks to align its navigation with while it's flying. And so one challenge that bees face is that in many cases, you can't fill up just one flower or even one flower patch with a single visit and then fly back, because the rewards in flowers are very small. And so often you need to visit multiple patches in sequence to fill up once before you then fly home, regurgitate the nectar that you've collected, and then embark on another foraging trip. And this challenge of linking multiple locations in a way that minimizes travel distance and travel time in humans is called the traveling salesman problem. And that could be that in the course of a day, you need to visit multiple towns around Mexico City, and the evening you want to go back and visit, let's say, Toluca and Tepoztlan and Cuernavaca all in a day while minimizing travel distance. And that's not a trivial challenge. The number of possible solutions goes up quite steeply with the number of destinations. And yet that is a challenge that, of course, bees need to solve on a daily basis. So what you see here is a challenge where we've put up 5 feeding stations in an environment where there were otherwise no flowers, and the nest, the hive, was here. And we then ask, well, how do you now navigate this problem? And you can see this route here is clearly not yet optimal, but this is a relatively naive bee that still needs to learn its path. Of course, they're not given a map to start with. They have to first find out where these feeding stations are. But what we can do is follow the same bee over multiple flights and see how it improves its solution. And that's what you can see on the right here. So this is sped up quite a bit, but what you can see is the bee's flight track. She's now discovered these 2 locations, now 2 more, and now she's discovered the 5th one. But you can also see that clearly in these early bouts, we're now in 12 sequential flights. The path initially is not optimal, but gradually the bee gets better and better at straightening out its paths until in the end, she basically finds the optimal route and then largely sticks with that optimal route. So they're very good at solving these multiple destination traveling salesperson type problems. But what we were also interested in is leaving the bees basically to their own devices without setting any spatial challenges and asking, well, how would you like to organize your life if we just leave you undisturbed except for that transponder on your back? And what you're seeing here is a bee's very first flight ever. This is a bee that's never been outside the nest. It's sped up 130 times. So the whole flight in reality is over 2 hours. And you can see, so green is always early and then yellow and red is later. So this fades to red in the end. And you can see the bee makes loops in various directions from the home base, always returns to the vicinity of the home base and then flies out in a different direction. So it's exploring in all directions. And also of interest later, we will take a reference to the fact that on the first flight, one of these loops ended up in this forest edge over here. We'll come back to that later. So that was one flight, 2 hours, and the bee explored in all directions to familiarize itself with the environment of the nest. Now, we're following the same individual for its entire life, basically. And you can see now, again, green is early, orange in the middle, red is later. On the next day, the bee makes one more exploratory loop in a southwesterly direction. And now she's found something. She's found a rewarding patch up at this forest edge. And then, like an assembly line worker, just focuses on exploiting this particular patch. So she's now switched entirely from a phase of exploration to one of patch exploitation, and basically spends several days, several dozen foraging flights, just going back and forth between her home base and this forest edge. And then the bee was stuck inside a few days because of rainy weather. And then she came back. We're now on starting on day 11 with the first green flights. And you can see for a few more times, she flew to the same destination. And then on a normal outbound flight in the direction of this patch, appeared to change her mind and flew basically to a different patch that she had only visited a single time 10 days earlier. Because we have the complete record of everything the bee does, we know where she's been, but we also know where she's not been. And so she hadn't been back to that patch over here since day one. Yet she flew directly there without actually tracing her steps back to the nest, seemingly retrieving this distant memory of a different location entirely from memory and flying there by a new route that she hadn't flown before. And that, of course, to us, while this study is entirely observational, it's not an experiment. We're just following a bee that does what it wants to do. There appears to at least be some indication of a kind of cognitive map of locations outside the familiar route-based memories. Now, when I explain these kinds of results to colleagues working with primates and corvid birds and so on, they would always be a bit dismissive and say, well, okay, we believe that a bee can learn flower colors and roots because that's what a bee does. She's pre-programmed to be a good navigator and a flower visitor. But what about, they would say, what about tasks that are outside the range of challenges that bees naturally face? Let me see if I can get this audio to play.
One question. In the previous one, I was just wondering if the second location, the resources there were better or worse than the first location. You know what I mean? In the exploitation side, the bee decided that the second was the second to take.
So we don't know because these are natural resources, and of course it's very hard to sample the thousands of flowers that a bee might visit in a single bout, but that's what we infer. So what probably happened here is that this patch became less profitable than what the bee expected, and so she retrieved that distant memory of a different patch. But we don't know the quality of the reward in this particular examinations because here we focused on following the bee around entirely with all the person power that we had.
Could the rain change something? The rain between the two paths?
It's a possibility, but again, we don't know this.
Yeah. So when they are making these trajectories, what's the mind of a bee thinking about getting food or constructing the nest? In which stage of the life of a bee is this happening?
So this is an adult worker bee that is foraging outside the nest. And so the question here about mental processes that I want to provoke is that, of course, there are various ways in which you can find your way around familiar space. One is simply memorizing familiar routes where you say, okay, I have to fly 1 kilometer northwest from my home base along landmarks A, B, and C to get to a familiar destination. That wouldn't be particularly complex. But what this indicates, although it's not an experiment, it's just an observational study, is that a bee can actually navigate to a familiar destination along an unfamiliar route, basically thinking about where is this destination from a starting point from which I've never flown to it before. So that's what this indicates and why it's interesting for us. Yeah. One small request, I think that if we could leave most questions to the end, unless there's something that you really, that I've failed to explain properly. In that case, do interrupt me, because if you're losing my thread because I've explained something incompletely, then let me know. But most questions might be best placed at the end. Otherwise, we might never get to the end. All right. So what I wanted to show you now is a video of a contrast between an experiment that definitely no bee has ever done before in its evolutionary history, and that's a so-called string pulling task. And let's see if we can hear this video.
We've recently discovered something even more surprising about insects.
Audio is good?
It turns out that some are really, really smart. One test of intelligence in animals is when they're given a problem, they can work out a solution in their heads. Hang a piece of food from a perch, out of reach, and a smart bird like a raven soon works out what to do. Just pull the string, hold it with your foot, pull a bit more, and in no time at all, you have a snack. Yet anything a mere vertebrate can do, bumblebees can also do this, even though they must be trained to solve the problem. Pull the string and reach a reward of nectar. Now, this bee hasn't been trained at all. But if she's allowed to watch her nestmate solving the problem, she knows exactly what to do when she gets her turn. Teachers and students, and all with brains only the size of pinheads. Combine this with the flexibility of the basic insect layout, and there's not much that insects can't do.
This was actually filmed in our lab, and the bird work was by a colleague of mine. But yeah, so there was a surprise there. But the wonderful thing with this kind of social learning of string pulling is that, of course, you can observe how a novel technique like that spreads through an entire colony in the same way as people who are interested in exploring how memes spread in human social media networks, where they're copied, where they're invented, where they're first copied, how rapidly they spread, and so on. And that's what we've done here. So all the individuals of a colony are arranged as dots in a circle. And whenever you see a line forming between two dots, that's an interaction between two bees of the kind that you've just seen, one experienced individual and one non-experienced individual. And when the dots turn colored, that means that the bee has now learned the task for the first time. So the first individual that mastered the task was yellow 31. So that's the individual here at the top. And you can now see a good number of orange individuals. These are all the bees that have learned the technique from yellow 31. But meanwhile, there's a new color here. One purple bee is here, one purple bee is there. And these are individuals that have no longer picked up the string pulling technique from yellow 31, but from one of the orange bees. And so there are basically several sequential generations, although of course they're not biological generations, these are actually all sisters, but several sequential sets of individuals that are previously naive and then learn the technique. And you even found in this particular colony, eventually the yellow 31 died. So they only get to live about 3 weeks typically in bumblebees. And nonetheless, the technique continued spreading through the colony even afterwards. So you have basically a culture-like process of this behavioral innovation spreading, which then subsequently becomes unique to this particular colony and is of course not shared by any other bumblebee colony in the world unless they're also trained in this way. And when you have multiple such individuals trained like that, then they even seem to cooperate in pulling strings together. In fact, Olli Lukala, who was part of his original work, has now in his own lab found that bees can be trained to cooperate on tasks that they cannot solve individually. So for the next experiment, I'll let Jane Goodall do the introduction. The primate people among you may know Jane Goodall. She sadly passed away recently, but here she's giving a little speech about our bees.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards, rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So we learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah, so this for me was very moving, because Jane Goodall was, I guess, one of my role models when I was a young person and decided to study animal behavior. And normally, I think often primate cognition workers are a bit arrogant towards our insect work, but for Jane Goodall to take note of our bumblebee work and basically say, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bees was quite something. So it's good to have heroes. Anyway, let me explain this experiment in a bit more detail, because here the social learning involves a bit more than just copying. So what you're seeing in this display here is, again, a target area marked as a yellow circle. And then there are, in this case, 3 different balls. And obviously, the best way to solve the task, if the goal is to move a ball into the center, is to pick the closest ball, is to pick the one that's already closest to the destination. But this bee here, the experienced bee, actually knows that that won't work, because we've glued that ball and that ball to the surface. They can't be moved. And this bee knows that. She's learned only the most distant ball is mobile. And so that's what she does. She picks the furthest ball, rolls it to the center, and then both the experienced bee and the naive bee get a big reward. And the question then is, what does the observer do after seeing this a few times and getting rewarded? And so the one option is that the observer simply apes or copies the actions that she's seen being performed, moving the furthest ball. Or if the observer actually gets what the task is about, she wouldn't copy it, but instead reach the same goal by moving the closest ball. And so this is what we're seeing here. So the observer comes in, finds 3 balls at different distances, and they're now not glued down. And she picks the closest ball. And you can see she's quite clumsy, because that bee has never rolled a ball for a reward before. She's just seen the other bee do it. But she clearly doesn't just copy the actions that she's seen being performed, but instead spontaneously solves the problem in a better way than what has been shown to her, which indicates to us that there is some form of understanding of the desired end state of the action rather than just a copying of the actions themselves. Now, do bees have mental images of flowers? On the one hand, perhaps the answer seems obvious. If they can recognize flowers in the field and return to the same flowers over and over, then it seems that clearly they must somehow remember the shape. But it's actually not so easy to prove that an animal that remembers an image actually can think about an image. So your mobile phone presumably can recognize your face, but it can't mentally picture your face in any abstract form. It just recognizes it by storing certain parameters, feature detectors that measure presumably distance between the eyes and some sort of landmarks and so on. But there's no mental image of your face in your phone. But one way, and it turns out in bees as well, you can explain quite a bit of flower recognition with simple so-called feature detector neurons that memorize edge orientations and color detectors and so on. But one way of asking whether an animal can actually has some sort of mental representation of a shape is via so-called cross-modal recognition experiments. And so what we're asking here is a quite simple task. We're training a bee to distinguish a sphere, a ball, from a cube, first in the visual modality. And then we're asking, if you've learned this, can you now recognize the same shape using a different sensory modality, in this case, touch alone? And the idea there is very similar to, perhaps some of you are familiar with this old-fashioned children's birthday party game where you're either blindfolded or you're reaching into a bag. You have to identify an object by touch. So you have to find among a clutter of objects a spoon, a screwdriver, a key, or a coin, just by feeling it. And of course, in that case, the sensory input and the temporal structure of the sensory input is completely different. So you now have to recognize the object with a very different sensory input. You cannot just use feature detectors from the modality in which you've originally learned the task. And so that's what we did with the bees. We then confronted them with the same objects in complete darkness, so under infrared light, that they'd previously seen. And here in this situation, the objects are presented under a plexiglass lid, so they can be seen but not touched. Here, they can be touched but not seen. And indeed, bees that have previously been rewarded in a visual setting on the balls also find the balls and prefer the balls when in complete darkness they can only touch them. And we can also do the reverse experiment where we're teaching the bees in complete darkness and then testing them after they've identified the correct objects using touch alone. We're then confronting them with a situation where they can see the objects but not touch them. So this is shown here. So there are again some plexiglass dishes, and you can see the bee sort of on the right side inspects the ball visually, but then rejects it and comes back to the cube. So they can also recognize the opposite shape when the same shape when they're trained first in darkness using touch and then recognizing them in the light. Now, given all of this work with various balls, I guess it was only a question of time before someone, in this case, Samadhi Galpayaga, one of my PhD students, asked, do they just like playing with balls? And so she did some experiments in which there was no reward ever, no appetitive reward ever given to the bees in association with these balls. She basically built some sort of small playground arenas that were in a different location to the food locations. And yet bees again and again returned to these locations where the only reward was the activity itself, as if the rolling of balls was rewarding in itself. And perhaps unsurprisingly, young bees did this more than older bees. And Also, unsurprisingly, male bees did this a lot more than female worker bees, which is in part because male bees do absolutely no useful work for the colony. So all the provisioning of the brood and colony defense is done by workers. Males have a lot more time on their hands because they're not doing any kind of useful work for the colony, but they do love playing with balls. So this perceived enjoyment of the activity in itself takes me to the last and perhaps most controversial question of whether bees could actually be said to have emotion-like states. And so this is obviously, can an insect feel something, might appear to many of you as a ridiculous question. And in fact, I have to admit that 20, 25 years ago, I would have said the same. This study here changed my mind a little bit. At least it got me thinking in that direction of whether it's plausible. And this is a study where we asked if bees can learn about predation threat. And there are certain species of spiders that, like you can see in these images, don't build webs, but they are sit and wait predators that hide on flowers. And some species, they can actually take on the color of the flower, like a chameleon, and they just wait for these predators, for pollinators on the flowers. And we took this situation into the laboratory with what we called our robotic crab spiders. So we either had highly cryptic or more visible crab spiders and paired these with pincers that are sponge clad, so they could briefly catch a bee and then release it as in an unsuccessful predation attempt. And I'll show you a little video of how that looks. So here the bee lands on a safe flower, that's fine. But now she makes a mistake. It lands on a spider-infested flower. So the bee is unharmed, I can reassure you. They're very, very soft sponges. But the idea was, we simply did this investigation to test if bees could learn about the spider appearance and subsequently avoid the flowers. And the perhaps unsurprising result is that they did. They learned to avoid the flowers quite swiftly after such attempts. But oh no, I don't have a slide for that. So, but the observation that surprised us was a different one. It was that the bees displayed a lot of false alarms after these experiences. That is, especially if they had experiences with cryptic spiders, the ones that were hard to see, they would scan a flower extensively and then reject it, basically as if they'd seen a ghost. And so these were perfectly safe flowers, and they would inspect them and then fly away. And that, and I'm speaking deliberately anthropomorphically now, but it did look a bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder. Basically conjuring up a threat just from memory rather than from something that's actually presently there. But this study was not designed to probe this. It just had this surprising result about the false alarms that we had not expected, which got us going, thinking into the direction of whether there might be some sort of anxiety-like state. But how could one we then confronted with ambiguous stimuli, such as turquoise. So that's exactly in the middle now, and we're asking, how do you now respond to this ambiguous stimulus? And after training, what you usually see, so there's only in one flight, there's only ever one stimulus that's shown. And if the bee knows blue is good, they'll fly straight there without hesitation and just go to the blue target. And if they know that green is no good, then of course they'll fly about forever. And then after minutes of hesitation, they might then say, okay, if you're not giving me anything, giving me my blue color, then I might as well try this green thing, but only after a very long delay. Okay. The question then is, what do they do with the stimulus in the middle? How do they respond to the glass that's 50% filled? And it turns out that this is dependent on what happened to the bees before they actually started the test. If we're giving them a little drop of sugar water before the test, they respond to this ambiguous stimulus much more readily than in a control where they're not giving this surprise reward. And this is shown on the right here. So we're looking at these hesitation times before they're accepting the flowers. And for the positive stimulus, let's say blue, on the left, the response time is very short. So they immediately fly there. For the negative stimulus, and on the right here, so that would be the green stimulus in this group, the hesitation is, well, close to 2 minutes on average before they're accepting. So the interesting thing is what happens with the stimuli in the middle, the turquoise one, the ambiguous one. That's the glass 50% filled. And it turns out that if you do not give the bees a surprise reward, that's the black curve here, then they're treating this stimulus pretty much like green, like the negative stimulus. But if, on the other hand, they are given a surprise reward, then the response time is much closer to the positive stimulus. So the response to the same stimulus shifts to a more rapid acceptance if they've had a surprise reward before the test. And it turns out that this change in behavior is dopamine mediated, as it is in us. So they get a little dopamine hit whenever they get a surprise reward and then respond more positively to this ambiguous stimulus. Others have done the opposite experiment where they've exposed bees to a surprise predator attack, and then the entire curve shifts in the opposite direction. So there's more hesitation towards the ambiguous stimulus. So while that still doesn't tell us directly about an emotion like this, we're at least using the same criteria that have been used for mammals and so on. So we're not lowering the bar, and at least from that, it at least looks like there is a kind of optimism-like state in the bees with surprise rewards. Before I finish, a very brief excursion into the beauty of a bee's brain. So they are small, and they do have very small neuron numbers compared to our brains, for example. This is a frontal view of a bee's brain. These blue shaded areas are the visual ganglia that process visual information from the eyes. This kind of telephone dial arrangement, old-fashioned telephone dial that is, the antennal lobe is processing olfactory information that comes from the antenna. And both areas project to the so-called mushroom bodies. These are dorsal convoluted structures, convoluted a bit like a cortex, in an insect brain that function as centers of multisensory integration as well as associative learning. And the total number of neurons in a honeybee's brain is under 1 million. In bumblebees that have somewhat larger brains, it's about 1 million. So from that number, you might be led to believe that that must be a fairly simple brain until you actually look at the structure of these individual nerve cells. So here's just one visual interneuron, and you can see that this particular neuron basically has a structure as finely branched as a fully grown tree, only of course very elegantly miniaturized. So the visual system alone has about 216,000 such nerve cells, all wired up and linked in with up to 1,000 synapses with other neurons. And there are 150 types of neurons just in the visual ganglia, which actually exceeds the number of neuron types in the human retina. So by all means, they are not simple brains. And you can see a little simulation. This is actually from a fly brain from a colleague at Harvard. And it shows a single neuron structure as well as how it's wired up with a dozen other neurons in the fly brain. And the fly brain, the fruit fly brain, of course, is an order of magnitude less complex than the one of bees. So these are not simple brains, of course. Ah, damn, I should have brought this in Spanish. But so this complexity of insect brains is something that was recognized very early on, in this case, by one of the founding fathers of neuroscience, Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who actually, in this case, drew a very detailed wiring diagram of the honeybee visual system. Many of these neuron types are identified and colored correctly, or colored by types correctly over a century ago. And this is what Ramón y Cajal said about the wonders of insect brains. And I feel somewhat embarrassed to read this to you in English, because it's, of course, written in Spanish. But this is what he said. The excellence of a psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, their gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, in building her marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. So, just to sum up the key messages, at least from what we can tell, bees do indeed have mental representations of space and of things in space. There are forms of object manipulation that qualify as at least simple tool use with what appears to us an awareness of the possible outcomes of their actions. There appears to be quite flexible access to even distant spatial memories. And I have to say this with the necessary caution, at least it appears that using similar criteria as vertebrate researchers use, that they might have emotional-like states. And these are, as far as I'm concerned, key ingredients of a mind, however different that mind may be from our own or that of other animals. And to me, that induces a new kind of respect for these creatures specifically in the natural world around us more generally. I think that we as humans are suffering and enjoying and thinking and feeling beings in a world of other suffering and enjoying and thinking and feeling beings. And that comes, I think, with some additional obligations to conserve the natural world that's shaped all of these unique minds. All right, I'll stop now and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. I don't know, should I manage the discussion or does someone else want to share it, because I might lose track of who raised hands in which order. I think there were these two gentlemen, so I start with the person in the red jacket.
Yes, do you think that the bees have something similar to mirror neurons? Like if they observe other bees being punished, for instance, or killed, you will see some reactions to that?
So we don't know is the honest answer. And it would be very interesting to explore this, but I can't give you an answer to that question. Yeah.
The mind of a bee is so flexible. Why, along the many centuries that we have records of how they built the hives, they are very similar. They are essentially identical. And they are identical in one part of this world and as compared to another. So this flexibility is, for me, difficult to digest.
Mm-hmm.
Probably because I don't have enough information. But
So you are right that the okay. So the question is related to the observation that if you look at bees' architectures, if you think about the honeybee's comb structure, then they are similar, or indeed in some cases identical, over time, over the many millennia that people have kept bees, as well as across space in various different locations of the world. Now that said, of course, there is huge variation between different bee species. So many of the stingless bee species that we have in the Americas are even more elaborate in their architectures than are the honeybees. But there is the fact that there is at least some species-specific constraint. Now, so why isn't there more variation if there is so much flexibility? So the question is, what do you need the flexibility for? And so I guess in many cases, if the evolutionary pathways towards a species-specific structure have happened hundreds of thousands of years ago and have been optimized for that particular species' needs, then why would you need flexibility? So we can only test flexibility in meaningful ways in the way that Hubert and so on does, that is within the particular framework of what's useful for that species. What can these bees alter? How can they depart from what we observe in nature when they're specifically challenged with, for example, things like glass walls in the path of the construction? But the most interesting scenarios, to my mind, are where you find variation within species in the architecture. And that indeed does occur in some stingless bee species. So many stingless bees build horizontal combs rather than vertical ones. And there are some species, for example, that facultatively build either parallel horizontal combs or a spiral shape. And some Brazilian colleagues have done a beautiful investigation where they wondered if the question of whether one colony builds spiral shapes and the other perfectly horizontal combs is a learned one and a kind of culture that's maintained within a set of bees. And in that particular case, the answer is no. It turns out that the memory in that species is basically in the structure. So they have done experiments where they've moved bees from spiral-shaped colonies to horizontal ones and vice versa. And it turns out the bees just continue building what's already in place. So in that case, the memory is basically in the wax structure, not in the bees' heads. But these are, of course, they're the kinds of scenarios that one would have to explore where there is indeed variation within species. There are some investigations in honeybees, again, where people have raised bees on plastic combs with cells of different dimensionality. And indeed, at least on a subtle level, they do seem to learn the structure of the comb on which they've been raised. But of course, you can't train them to build square cells or triangles or something like that. So there are clearly some innate constraints, but there is also flexibility.
Thank you.
I'll go to the back over there, but do jump up and down if I miss someone. So,
have you studied, or is it known if a queen bee could go through the same learning curve as these working bees you showed?
So it depends on the species of bees. We haven't done such experiments, but one of my former postdocs, Nigel Rain, has looked at learning behavior in bumblebees. And just to zoom a little bit, in bumblebees, but not honeybees, the queens also visit flowers. So in the bumblebee queen has to basically manage to do everything by herself initially because she founds the colony as a single individual. So she has to visit flowers to feed herself and her brood. She has to build a wax structure. She has to make sure the brood is kept warm and provisioned with food until she has the first few workers, and then the workers take over with the foraging. And it turns out that queens are as good or better, bumblebee queens, at learning flowers. In honeybees, the queen is basically an egg-laying machine. And so she never has to visit flowers. She doesn't have to provision the brood and so on. And over a century ago already, people have noted that in proportion to their bodies, the honeybee queen's brain is diminutively small compared to a worker's. So that's, I guess, a universal rule. If you don't need parts of your brain, then the first thing you do is you melt it, because it's actually expensive to maintain if you don't need it. Over at the far corner there, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, regardless of the definition of mind, I guess my hunch is that it has to do with subjective experience. In the sense that maybe the colony has a need, and they all work together, the wax shape, like hexagonal wax shape. However, one would expect that one individual at some point would say, I don't care, I will make it square. Or something different, like differences among individuals within a colony. So my question is if you have observed these kind of things.
So there is both variation in the geometry of cells, and there is also correction behavior. So that if certain parts, so they're essentially, of course, built from little slivers of wax that the bees glue together, and often different individuals take over where another individual left off. And in the process, corrections of mistakes are also made. But I don't think that is necessarily the best kind of setting to look at subjective experience. So when we're thinking about subjective experiences, we're indeed asking whether by similar criteria as are used in other species, we can diagnose emotion-like states, we can diagnose a perceptual world that at least for all we know, indicates some form of mental picturing of objects or the landscape around the individuals and so on. Yeah, and just to admit that this is a difficult question. It's a difficult question in any animal, because they can't obviously explain their experiences to us, so our evidence is always indirect and speculative, but at least it's an interesting challenge to explore a question where we will not in the near future have formal certainty, but at least we can argue based on probabilities, I think. I think you were next.
Yeah, are there like those
Yes, so in all the tasks that we test, there is huge variation between individuals and also between colonies in how rapidly they learn certain tasks or whether they learn them at all.
Okay, let's say an individual learns one task quickly. Does that predict if that individual can learn another task also quickly?
Most likely, yes. So we haven't done this for the more complex tasks such as string pulling and ball rolling, because that takes a lot of time to train the individuals. But we've done exactly that sort of investigation with tasks where we train bees sequentially to learn colors as predictors of reward, odors, and shapes. And it turns out that individuals that are good at one of these are also faster at learning the other ones.
Do we have the diseases of the human mind? Like, for example, disease schizophrenia, paranoid behavior,
So I don't know, because we haven't explored that. But of course, my colleagues in Drosophila neuroscience and molecular biology use the fruit fly for pretty much every other human disorder, including chronic pain, anxiety-like states, depression. And it turns out they actually respond in many cases to similar drugs as humans do. And so again, while it's difficult to diagnose these conditions just from behavior, but at least from what my Drosophila colleagues can tell, these are similar states that also exist in insects. Otherwise, they couldn't so successfully use it as a model for all of these disorders.
Thank you for your talk. Assuming and comparing with the honeybee, you have a queen, you have a worker. That means that you have the same genome on all these individuals. That means only what we know part of this is the genetic regulation of different members of the colony can explain part of their abilities, their capacities, etc.
Yes, that's correct. So one of the, I guess, most remarkable in the sort of big question of genes versus the environment in determining who you end up as an adult. One of the most dramatic examples in the context of that question is the dimorphism between queens and workers in honeybees, because the differences are dramatic. First of all, the queen is much larger. She lives multiple times longer. So honeybee queens can live up to 7 years, whereas workers typically just live a few weeks. And of course, that's one of the reasons why people have been fascinated with the diet that is being fed to queens in the colony, because some people have thought that maybe if you can extend human lives by an order of magnitude or more using the same food. But that's exactly what happens in bees. And beyond that, of course, the brain morphology is different. As we mentioned, the entire behavioral specializations are also different. Yet they are genetically indistinguishable. So there are no appreciable differences in the genetic background of workers and queens. People have done quite early on already experiments where they've moved the eggs. So, sorry, one step back. Worker eggs are raised in these typical hexagonal comb cells in which the honey is also stored. Queen eggs are placed in completely differently shaped cells that are sort of shaped like a peanut and attached to the bottom of the comb. So you can tell 100% where a queen egg is laid and where a worker egg is laid, because the shape is different. So what people have done over a century ago is just switch the eggs around and moved an egg, let's say, from a queen cell to a worker cell, or from a worker cell to a queen cell. And it turns out that if you do that, you entirely determine the fate of that, the future fate of that egg, depending on where it's placed. So an egg taken from a worker cell, moved into a queen cell, will turn into a queen and live several years. Whereas if you take it out of a queen cell and put it into a worker cell, the opposite happens. And indeed, as you say, this is entirely determined by epigenetic factors that are to some extent added to the diet of the queens versus the workers. Yeah. Any further questions? Okay. Over there.
My question is that how much time to train a bee for one task? It depends on the food you give to the bee or not. Like you reward the bee with some sugar, and if the bee has she has enough food before that, and how much time if the bee is hungry to learn that.
So, I mean, learning speed depends on many factors. It depends on the difficulty of the task, of course. So, where the task is very simple, like learning a color as a predictor of the reward, you basically get one trial learning, even with relatively small rewards. But yes, the other main factor that determines learning speed is the amount of reward. So the more the merrier. Bees also like warmer sugar water more than colder sugar water. Some people, not us, have also experimented with starving bees for different durations to see, and that also has an effect. So rewards are perceived as larger after a period of no food. So yes, both food quality and hunger levels determine, and of course the reward qualities determine speed of learning. So are you guys all waiting to come into the next class? Okay. I'm happy to continue for as long as there are questions. Go on.
Okay. So I had the question if this has like cruelty behaviors, because I've heard that there is kind of an anecdotal correlation between intelligence and the ability to be evil, like to do cruel things, for example, in the case of the dolphin. So I had the question if, have you seen some cruel behaviors into smart insects?
So I can't think of an example where bees are nasty just for fun. But I mean that's the question. So I think there are observations in some animals that they seem to derive some perverse pleasure out of just torturing other animals. If you think of domestic cats and their mice and so on. But of course, bees are sometimes romanticized as entirely vegan animals and as an entirely harmonious society. And if you look closely, it's not quite so simple. So first of all, if you think about the life of a bee queen, the first thing a bee queen does when she emerges, so there are often multiple queens raised, the first thing the new queen does is find all of her other potential competitor sisters and kills them. There are also, of course, cases for bumblebees, for example, sometimes large workers start laying eggs. And in some cases, this results in violent confrontations with the queen, where they then eat each other's eggs, for example. So they can also eat and digest animal protein under certain conditions. And of course, there is fierce competition between colonies, where bees, even of generally peaceful bee species, they will raid other colonies or compete with them for nectar. There are also specialized kleptoparasitic bees that do nothing but raid other colonies. So not everything is peace and happiness in the world of bees, but I'm not aware of any deliberate nastiness beyond just competitive interactions and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. So I guess the official discussion finishes here, but if you do have any more questions, just come to the front now and we can chat some more. All right.